Monster Hunter Wilds is hiding hundreds of secrets in its monsters, maps, item descriptions, and animations that most players never notice. And today, we are going through every single one of them, all 261 of them. So I have been sitting on this video for a while. Monster Hunter Wilds dropped and I immediately went into cataloging mode. I kept a running document open the whole time I was playing, pausing to write down item descriptions, field guide entries, environmental details in the ruins, NPC dialogue most people skip through on their way to the next hunt. What I found was that the deeper you look into this game, the more it rewards you for paying attention. The world building in Wilds is embedded in layers. There is the surface layer that the story gives you, and then there is this enormous secondary layer built entirely out of texture, implication, and deliberate design choices. I wanted to make a video that actually sits with those details rather than rushing past them. That is why this video is 8 hours long. I also chose to organize the content thematically rather than by monster or by chronological order, because I think the connections between categories are more interesting than a straight line rundown. One specific choice I made when putting this together was to exclude any content that felt too speculative without some in-game textual anchor. Everything here has at least one piece of concrete evidence behind it, even if the conclusion I draw from it is my own interpretation. These are not confirmed canon explanations. They are the most supported readings I could put together. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1: The Forbidden Lands and How This World Was Built. The Forbidden Lands were not always forbidden. That is the first thing worth sitting with before we get into any of the specific details, because the name itself suggests an active prohibition rather than simply a dangerous natural environment. Early game dialogue and the introductory field notes you collect in the first few hours of Wild strongly point toward the idea that this region was once mapped, partially charted, and at some point deliberately sealed off. There is a distinction between a place people cannot reach and a place people decided others should not go. The Forbidden Lands fall into the second category, and that distinction ends up being important for almost everything else we're going to talk about in this chapter. Fact 1 is simply this: someone, at some point, made a choice to call this region forbidden, and the game is quietly asking you to wonder who made that choice and why. The name itself carries a translation layer worth noticing. In the original Japanese version of Monster Hunter Wilds, the region is referred to with phrasing that is closer in meaning to the lands of prohibition than the more passive-sounding forbidden lands that the localization uses. That is a subtle but meaningful difference. Prohibition implies enforcement. It implies an authority that issued the decree and at some point had the power to make it stick. The English localization softens that slightly, turning it into something that sounds more like a warning on a map, rather than a legal or institutional judgment. This is fact 2, and it matters because it suggests the guild, or some predecessor organization, had a specific reason to issue that prohibition, and possibly the means to enforce it at a time when the region was accessible. The Windward Plains, which is the first major biome you enter in Wilds, has a geological detail that most players walk right past. The storm corridors in that region, the long channels where the massive wind events funnel through, are not random. They follow the same paths every single time they occur because the landscape has been shaped by those exact same storms, running through those exact channels, for what the geological evidence suggests is thousands of years. The cliff formations on the edges of those corridors are smooth on the windward side and jagged on the leeward side, which is consistent with long-term erosion from a highly consistent and predictable wind source. Fact 3 is that the storms in the Windward Plains are not weather events in the traditional sense. They are more like geological processes happening on a timescale that happens to be short enough to observe within a single hunt. If you spend time looking at the exposed rock faces in the Windward Plains, particularly in the sections of the map that are far from the main monster patrol routes, you will find fossils embedded in the stone. This is not particularly unusual for a game like this, but the specific shapes of those fossils do not correspond to any monster species that currently exists in the game. The silhouettes visible in the stone suggest megafauna with a body plan distinct from any of the current residents of the Windward Plains, including the Doshaguma packs and the various smaller creatures you encounter during exploration. Fact 4 is that the Windward Plains was once home to at least one large species that no longer exists, and the game gives you the fossil evidence to notice that without ever drawing your attention to it directly. The colour of the sand in the Windward Plains is a detail that functions on both an aesthetic and an ecological level. Under normal conditions, the plains present a golden amber tone during daylight hours, which shifts toward deeper rust orange as the sun moves lower. During inclemency events, that colour changes. The sand takes on a darker, almost brownish red hue that is visually striking, but also mechanically significant. This colour shift corresponds to a change in the mineral composition of the airborne particles during high wind events. The inclemency stirs up lower geological strata, bringing different mineral concentrations into the air. Fact 5 is that this mineral shift is directly connected to why Ray Dow, the electric bird wyvern of the Windward Plains, prefers to generate and discharge electricity during inclemency events. The specific mineral composition of the storm-stirred sand acts as a more efficient conductor for the type of bioelectrical discharge Ray Dow produces. Ray Dow itself is worth spending some time on as a piece of ecological design. Its anatomy is built around the idea of a creature that generates electricity not through dedicated biological organs, like an electric eel, but through a combination of friction, crystal structures embedded along its body, and the mineral content of its immediate environment. The crystal formations that grow along its dorsal surfaces are not decorative, they are functional charge accumulators. When Ray Dow shakes or vibrates its body during windy conditions, those crystals generate a piezoelectric effect, building a static charge that the monster then concentrates and discharges. Fact 6 is that Ray Dow's signature electric attack, where it whips its tail or wing edge through a charged sand cloud, is mechanically analogous to the same principle as a Van de Graaff generator. The game does not explain this directly, but the monster's field guide entry uses language that points strongly toward this interpretation. The Doshaguma, packs that roam the Windward Plains, are another piece of layered design that rewards attention. On the surface, they are pack-hunting fanged beasts that behave similarly to a highly aggressive primate-wolf hybrid. But their social structure, as implied by how they behave during territorial encounters and how the pack hierarchy manifests in their patrol patterns, suggests a level of social complexity that goes beyond most monster categories in the franchise. Specific individuals within the pack appear to hold consistent rank-adjacent roles. There are scouts. There are what appear to be guards stationed at the edges of patrol routes, and the largest individual in a given pack consistently initiates group responses to perceived threats, rather than simply being the first to charge. Fact 7 is that the Doshaguma pack structure reflects a form of cooperative intelligence that the game presents as an ecological fact about the Windward Plains, rather than as something special or anomalous. There is a resting site in the Windward Plains that most players discover fairly early in the game, but rarely spend time examining carefully. It is a sheltered cleft in the rock, where Doshaguma individuals will sometimes retreat during severe inclemency events. If you reach this site during or just after a major storm event and observe without engaging, you will occasionally see members of the pack engage in what appears to be mutual grooming behaviour, with smaller individuals approaching the pack leader after the storm subsides. This is a behavior that does not affect gameplay in any way and is never referenced in dialogue or in the field guide. Fact 8 is that the developers included an ambient social behavior sequence for the doshaguma that is purely observational and has no mechanical function, which points toward a design philosophy in wilds that prioritizes ecological believability over pure gameplay utility. The Scarlet Forest biome presents a contrast to the Windward Plains that goes beyond simple visual aesthetics. Where the plains feel exposed and geological, the forest feels layered and biological. The red coloration of the forest's canopy is not the result of autumn-like seasonal change or unusual soil chemistry in the traditional sense. The field guide entries for the endemic life of the Scarlet Forest suggest that the reddish pigmentation of the dominant tree species is an evolutionary adaptation that provides UV protection in a region with high solar exposure during the dry season. The red pigment functions similarly to anthocyanins in real-world plants, essentially acting as a natural sunscreen. Fact 9 is that the Scarlet Forest looks the way it does because of a photobiological adaptation, which means the colour of the biome is telling you something about its climate history. The canopy of the Scarlet Forest does more than filter light aesthetically. It creates a specific humidity microclimate at ground level that differs significantly from the conditions experienced at canopy height. Monsters that live primarily at or near ground level in the Scarlet Forest, including some of the smaller fanged beasts and bird wyverns encountered there, show adaptations to high humidity, low light conditions. Monsters that hunt from the canopy or that use the upper branches as patrol routes are adapted to the drier, brighter conditions above the canopy layer. Fact 10 is that the Scarlet Forest's ecosystem is functionally stratified, with distinct ecological niches at different vertical layers, and the monsters you encounter in that biome reflect that stratification in their biology and behaviour. The oil well basin is probably the most unusual biome in wilds from a geological standpoint. The presence of naturally occurring oil seeps creating pools and channels throughout the cavern system implies a geological history involving the decomposition of massive organic material over an extremely long time span. In the real world, oil deposits form over millions of years from compressed organic matter. The scale of the oil deposits visible in the oil well basin, combined with the presence of specialized organisms that have evolved to exploit those deposits, suggests this region has been geologically stable and biologically productive for an enormous length of time. Fact 11 is that the oil well basin is implicitly one of the oldest stable ecosystems in the Forbidden Lands, and the depth of its biological diversity reflects that deep history. New Udra, the Leviathan category elder dragon found in the oil well basin, has a design that directly reflects the extreme age and unusual chemistry of its home environment. Its ability to ignite and project oil-based substances is clearly tied to the abundance of flammable material in the basin, but the specific organ systems implied by its anatomy suggest a creature that has co-evolved alongside the oil-rich environment over an enormous time frame, rather than simply learning to exploit a resource. The bioluminescent organs, visible on New Udra's underside in low-light conditions, suggest deep-sea evolutionary pressure at some point in the lineage, which is interesting given that the oil well basin is technically a landlocked cavern system. Fact 12 is that New Udra's anatomy implies an ancestral lineage connected to deep aquatic environments, which points toward the geological history of the oil well basin, including a period when it was partially or fully submerged. The Ice Shard Cliffs biome is built around a visual contradiction that the environmental design resolves very elegantly. The name suggests cold, frozen conditions, and the upper portions of the cliffs are indeed a frozen alpine environment consistent with high-altitude monster habitats in previous Monster Hunter games. But the lower sections of the cliffs, particularly the cavern networks near the base, are geothermally active. Hot springs, mineral deposits with crystalline structures that only form under high-pressure, high-temperature conditions, and the presence of fire element leaning endemic life in the deeper cave sections all suggest a geothermal layer beneath the ice. Fact 13 is that the ice shard cliffs is not simply a cold biome, it is a biome experiencing an active geological tension between surface glaciation and subsurface thermal activity, and that tension is what makes it ecologically interesting. Jindahard, the magma elder dragon encountered in the ice shard cliffs, makes ecological sense precisely because of the geothermal dynamic we just discussed. A fire and magma-aligned elder dragon living in a frozen mountain biome sounds contradictory until you understand that the heat Jindahard generates and the geological warmth of the subsurface environment are in dialogue with each other. Jindahard does not merely inhabit the cliffs, the creature appears to actively influence the thermal balance of the lower cavern sections through its movements and the material it leaves behind. Fact 14 is that Jindahard's presence in the ice shard cliffs is not an ecological anomaly. The monster is, in one possible reading of the field guide material, a geologically significant organism that maintains the thermal equilibrium of the biome by continuously cycling heat from the deep subsurface to the middle cavern layer. The ruins of Wyveria are the most narratively loaded biome in the entire game, and we are going to spend significant time on them in later chapters. But even from a purely geographic perspective, they tell a story. The ruins are not located in an isolated pocket of the Forbidden Lands. They are positioned at what appears to be a geographic nexus, a point where the other four biomes converge or nearly converge. This is not an accident of level design. The positioning of Wyveria at the centre of the Forbidden Lands' geography suggests that whoever built the structures there intended to have access to all of the surrounding ecosystems simultaneously. Fact 15 is that Wyveria was built at the centre of the Forbidden Lands by choice, and that choice implies knowledge of all 5 biomes and a reason to want proximity to all of them. There is a transition zone between the Windward Plains and the Scarlet Forest that most players pass through quickly as part of the main quest, but rarely return to afterward. This zone features a mix of the sandy mineral substrate of the plains and the dense root and leaf litter floor of the forest, creating a patch ecology that supports a distinct subset of endemic life found nowhere else in the game. Several small insects and ground-dwelling creatures visible in this transition zone do not appear in any other location on the map. Fact 16 is that Monster Hunter Wilds includes microhabitats in its biome transition zones that support unique species assemblages, and these transition zones are populated with creatures that exist purely to make the ecology feel coherent rather than to serve any gameplay function. The weather systems in Wilds are interconnected in a way that the game implies but never explicitly states. Rain events that occur in the Scarlet Forest do not stay contained to that biome. The moisture generated by heavy rain in the forest appears in subsequent in-game time periods as increased fog and elevated humidity in the adjacent sections of the Windward Plains. This is consistent with how real-world weather systems work near forest-desert boundaries. The forest acts as a moisture source, and the dry plains act as a moisture sink. Fact 17 is that the weather events in Monster Hunter Wilds appear to be connected across biome boundaries, following atmospheric logic that is consistent with real-world meteorology at a broad scale. The day and night cycle in Wilds does more than change the lighting and spawn certain nocturnal monsters. The cycle appears to affect the behavioral states of almost every monster species in the game in ways that go beyond simple diurnal/nocturnal categorization. Monsters that are primarily active during the day do not simply disappear at night. They shift to different activity types, reduced foraging radius, proximity to territorial core areas, and increased alertness to sound rather than visual stimuli. This behavioural shift is visible in the AI patterns but is also reflected in the field guide descriptions, which note preferred activity periods and how those periods affect encounter behaviour. Fact 18 is that the day and night cycle in wilds is implemented as an ecological simulation rather than just a gameplay clock, with each species in the game responding to time of day in ways that reflect their real-world biological analogues. The endemic life of the Forbidden Lands functions as an ecological indicator system. Certain small creatures, the flying insects, the burrowing invertebrates, the amphibian species found near water sources, appear in higher densities in areas of ecological health and lower densities in areas that have been disrupted by monster activity or environmental events. This creates a subtle but consistent visual language that experienced players can learn to read. An area with dense endemic life is likely to be stable and safe for brief resting. An area with sparse or absent endemic life may indicate recent monster activity, a curio presence, or some other environmental disruption. Fact 19 is that the endemic life distribution in wilds is a real-time ecological health indicator, and paying attention to it provides information that the game never tells you directly. The water sources in the Forbidden Lands follow underground channels that connect multiple biomes. This is visible in the gameplay through the presence of Balahara, the eel-like leviathan that can be encountered in water sources across different biomes. Balahara's range suggests it uses these underground water corridors to move between surface water sources, which in turn implies that the water chemistry and biological content of surface water in different biomes is ultimately connected through a shared underground system. Fact 20 is that the water system in the Forbidden Lands is not a collection of isolated bodies of water. It is a single networked system with surface expressions in multiple biomes, and the creatures that move through the underground portions of that system are the ecological connective tissue holding the whole thing together. The base camp in Monster Hunter Wilds is established in a location that is not arbitrary. If you look at the positioning of the base camp relative to the 5 biomes, it sits at a point that provides relatively equal access to all of them, while also being positioned at a natural geographic choke point that would have strategic value for any organisation monitoring large-scale monster movement across the region. The fact that previous expeditions left evidence of occupation in the same location, visible in the form of degraded equipment and old markers in the surrounding area, suggests this site has been recognised as strategically optimal for a long time. Fact 21 is that the base camp site was likely used by earlier survey teams, and the current expedition is not the first to recognise its strategic value. The food and ingredient system in wilds provides ecological information that is easy to overlook when you are focused on the stat buffs. The specific ingredients available from the Forbidden Lands, the local flora and fauna components used in cooking, reflect the actual ecological composition of the biomes you have explored. Rare ingredients that unlock after accessing specific biomes or completing specific ecological milestones are not just gameplay rewards. They are the game's way of representing ecological discovery. Finding a new ingredient means you have reached a part of the ecosystem that was previously inaccessible, and the flavour text on that ingredient typically contains a lore detail about the specific microhabitat where it was found. Fact 22 is that the ingredient system in wilds is a secondary lore delivery system, and reading the flavour text on new ingredients consistently rewards you with ecological details that are not available anywhere else. There is a persistent misconception in the Monster Hunter community that the Forbidden Lands are geographically separate from the new world introduced in Monster Hunter World. The lore in Wilds complicates this somewhat. Certain geographical references in NPC dialogue and in field notes suggest the Forbidden Lands are a region within or adjacent to the broader geographic territory explored by the Research Commission in World, rather than a completely separate landmass. The scale of the Forbidden Lands relative to the New World as a whole is deliberately left ambiguous, but the directional references in expedition logs suggest the Wilds research team travelled in a consistent direction from a known landmark. Fact 23 is that the Forbidden Lands are likely part of the same landmass or continental shelf system as the New World, rather than a geographically isolated territory. The rock formations in the Windward Plains contain a geological curiosity that points toward a history of significant biological activity in the deep past. Certain cliff faces, particularly in the northern sections of the map, show large-scale compression structures in the stone that are consistent with the accumulation and eventual petrification of enormous quantities of organic material. These are not fossil beds in the traditional sense. They are more like geological records of mass death events, layers of compressed biological material from what must have been catastrophic mortality events affecting large populations of organisms simultaneously. Fact 24 is that the Windward Plains has experienced at least one geological scale mass mortality event in its past, and the physical record of that event is visible in the cliff face compression layers for any player who spends time looking at the rock walls. The inclemency events in each biome are not simply weather, they are ecological forcing functions. Each biome's inclemency event is distinct in type and effect. Storms in the plains, fire events in specific zones, frost surges in the cliffs, and the specific type of inclemency associated with each biome is consistent with what would push that biome's ecology toward maximum stress. This suggests inclemency events function as selection pressure in the Forbidden Lands ecosystem. The organisms that thrive there are specifically those that can exploit or endure their biome's worst conditions, and the monsters that become dominant in each biome are the ones whose adaptations happen to align with surviving their biome's inclemency events. Fact 25 is that the inclemency system in Monster Hunter Wilds is implicitly a long-term evolutionary forcing mechanism, and the dominant predators in each biome owe their ecological success in part to having evolved responses to inclemency rather than simple fair weather superiority. The map design of the Forbidden Lands as a whole has an interesting property when you view it from above in its totality. The 5 biomes are not arranged randomly. The distribution of biome types around the central ruins of Wyveria follows a rough elemental logic. The Windward Plains, associated with wind and electricity, occupies a northern position. The Scarlet Forest, associated with fire and organic growth, sits to the east. The Oil Well Basin, with its flammable chemistry and dark aquatic conditions, fills the southern sectors. The Ice Shard Cliffs, with their ice fire tension, occupy the west. And Wyveria sits in the centre, associated with no single element, but with something older and stranger than elemental categories suggest. Fact 26 is that the biome arrangement of Monster Hunter Wilds follows a deliberate elemental geographic logic, and this arrangement mirrors a cosmological framework hinted at in the ruins of Wyveria itself. There are points in the Forbidden Lands where you can observe what appears to be long-distance monster migration. Specific individuals from the Scarlet Forest's flying wyvern population will occasionally travel across the transition zones and into the margins of the Windward Plains, following what appear to be ancient flyways that predate the current conditions of either biome. These migration observations are time-locked. They only occur during specific weather conditions and time of day windows, and they are easy to miss if you're not in the right place at the right time. Fact 27 is that Monster Hunter Wilds includes observational migration events for certain species that are only visible during narrow time of day and weather windows, and these migrations suggest the biome boundaries are permeable in ways that the standard habitat descriptions do not fully account for. The game's ecology includes what appears to be a nutrient cycle operating across multiple biomes. Large monsters that die during hunts or territorial conflicts are consumed not just by scavengers visible to the player, but by the landscape itself. Boneyard areas in the game, places where large skeletal remains accumulate, are consistently associated with high densities of specific plant life and endemic fauna. The bones act as nutrient sources for the plant community, and the plant community supports a specific assemblage of smaller animals. This nutrient cycle, from apex predator death to plant growth to small animal life to scavenger activity, is implied by the spatial distribution of species across the map rather than being explicitly stated anywhere. Fact 28 is that Monster Hunter Wilds includes a cross-trophic nutrient cycle embedded in its ecology, and the location of boneyard areas on the map is functionally the map's way of showing you where the most biologically productive spots in the Forbidden Lands actually are. The final fact for this chapter concerns the relationship between the ecosystem as a whole and the concept of the Forbidden Lands as a prohibition rather than a natural boundary. If you take all of the ecological evidence discussed so far, the deep age of the oil well basin, the geological catastrophe record in the plains, the nutrient cycles, the migration patterns, the biome arrangement, you get a picture of an ecosystem that is extraordinarily complex, deeply interconnected, and self-sustaining in ways that far exceed what a typical game world ecology needs to accomplish. This level of ecological detail, most of which the player never has to engage with directly, suggests that the designers of Wilds built the Forbidden Lands specifically as a world that deserved to be forbidden. Not because it is simply dangerous, but because it is a system so carefully balanced that any disruption at the scale a large hunting operation would produce could have cascading consequences. Fact 29 is that the ecological design of the Forbidden Lands is itself the argument for why the place was prohibited, and the game trusts you to figure that out on your own. Chapter 2: The Monsters, Biology, Behavior, and Hidden Details. The monster roster in Monster Hunter Wilds is doing something that the franchise has been building toward for a long time. Every monster in the game has a field guide entry, behavioral observations, visible through sustained watching, and a set of ecological relationships with other species that are implied by where they live and what they do. But Wilds takes this further than previous entries by embedding monster biology directly into the gameplay mechanics in ways that create a feedback loop between ecological observation and hunting strategy. Understanding why a monster does something is the same as understanding how to counter it, and the game rewards players who pay attention to the biological reasoning. Fact 30 is that in Monster Hunter Wilds, ecology and gameplay strategy are not separate systems. They are the same system described from different angles, and the monsters are designed to make that true at every level of their anatomy. Ray Dow's hunting behavior has a detail that most players only notice subconsciously. When Ray Dow is actively hunting prey rather than responding to the player as a threat, it performs a specific approach pattern that involves flying low over open ground to stir up sand with its wing downdraft, then banking sharply to use the freshly agitated mineral particles in its electric charge accumulation cycle. This hunting sequence, which you can observe if you watch the monster before triggering its aggro, reveals that Ray Dow is not simply an ambush predator. It is actively creating the environmental conditions it needs to hunt most efficiently. Fact 31 is that Ray Dow manufactures its own hunting environment by using its aerobatic flight pattern to produce the exact atmospheric conditions its electrical biology requires, which makes it one of the more behaviorally sophisticated predators in the game when observed in a non-combat context. The Doshiguma pack has a specific response to elder dragons that is different from its response to other large monsters. When a Doshiguma pack encounters an elder dragon in their territory, rather than fleeing or engaging, The pack adopts a monitoring formation. Individual members spread to the edges of the elder dragon's visible range and maintain position without approaching, essentially creating a loose perimeter of observers. This behavior has no obvious survival benefit, given the power differential, but it is consistent with a social animal that has evolved an information-gathering strategy rather than a fight-or-flight binary. The pack appears to be assessing the elder dragon, cataloguing its behavior, potentially for future avoidance or territory planning purposes. Fact 32 is that Doshaguma exhibits a category-specific threat assessment behavior when encountering elder dragons, suggesting a level of ecological intelligence that goes beyond predator-prey instinct. The Chotacabra is one of the more unusual monsters in wilds from a biomechanical standpoint. Its ability to coat rocks in a sticky secretion and then hurl them at targets combines a ranged attack capability with what is functionally a manufacturing behavior. The Chotacabra finds loose rock material, processes it with a specialized gland secretion, and creates a projectile optimized for adhesion rather than impact force. This is not a random behavior. It is a repeatable and intentional process that the monster performs in a specific sequence every time. Fact 33 is that the Chotacabra is technically using a form of tool modification for hunting and defense, which places it in a rare category of monster hunter creatures that engage in something analogous to simple material processing, a step above pure instinctual behavior. The Balahara's behavior in the underground water channels of the Forbidden Lands has a detail that is easy to miss because most encounters with this creature happen in surface water sources. If you find a location where a Balahara is emerging from an underground channel entrance and observe it before it notices you, you can see that the creature takes several minutes to reoxygenate in surface water before becoming mobile and active. During this transition period, the Balahara is essentially vulnerable in ways it is not during an active encounter. Fact 34 is that the Balahara's biology reflects the reality of a creature that spends significant time in low-oxygen underground water environments, and its transition behavior between underground and surface conditions is implemented in the game as an observable ecological process rather than purely as a gameplay state change. Arkveld, the flagship monster of Monster Hunter Wilds, has a physical detail in its design that becomes more significant the more you look at it. The blade-like appendages on its arms are not simply weapon structures in the way that, say, a Tigrex's claws are weapons. The Arkveld's arm blades appear to have a dual function implied by their surface texture and the way the creature uses them in non-combat situations. In passive observational footage before a hunt triggers, Arkveld has been documented using the flat surfaces of these arm blades in what appears to be a sensory or communicative capacity, holding them at specific angles relative to the sun. Fact 35 is that the Arkveld's arm blades may serve a secondary function beyond combat, potentially as reflective or refractive surfaces used in communication or environmental sensing, a detail embedded in the passive animation set that the game never explicitly explains. Guardian monsters, which are monsters that have been altered by the curio parasite, do not simply become more aggressive versions of their base forms. The transformation appears to affect each monster species differently, depending on the specific biology of the host. Some species become faster, some become more durable, some develop new elemental capabilities they did not possess in their uninfected form. This variation in transformation outcome suggests the curio is not applying a uniform template, it is interacting with the specific biological infrastructure of each host and amplifying or modifying what is already there. Fact 36 is that the Guardian transformation is not a one-size-fits-all process. It is a biologically responsive modification that produces outcomes specific to each host species, which makes each Guardian encounter a distinct ecological puzzle rather than a simple difficulty scaling event. The Guardian Arcveld is distinct from base Arcveld in ways that go beyond power level. The specific visual changes in Guardian Arcveld, the altered coloration, the modifications to the arm appendages, and the behavioural shifts visible in its territorial patrol patterns suggest the curio infestation has pushed Arcveld toward a more extreme version of whatever biological role it occupied before infection. Arcveld's natural role in the ecosystem appears to be as an apex enforcer, a top-tier predator that maintains territorial boundaries across a large range. The Guardian transformation seems to have amplified this role to an ecological extreme, turning a territorial apex predator into something closer to an ecosystem-level control organism. Fact 37 is that Guardian Arcveld may not be simply a corrupted monster. It may be an ecologically amplified version of a function that Arcveld always performed, pushed past natural limits by the curio enhancement. Gore Magala returns in Monster Hunter Wilds, and its presence in the Forbidden Lands is worth examining for what it implies about the spread of the frenzy virus across the New World. Gore Magala's appearance in the Forbidden Lands could be coincidental, a territory expansion during its juvenile phase before its eventual maturation into Shagaru Magala. But the timing of its appearance relative to the curio activity in the region suggests a possible interaction between the frenzy virus that Gore Magala spreads and the scarlet blight associated with the curio. Fact 38 is that Gore Magala's presence in the Forbidden Lands points toward a possible ecological relationship between the frenzy virus and the scarlet blight. A relationship the game leaves deliberately unresolved but places enough evidence around to make it a meaningful question. The Nursilla that appears in Wilds shows a behavioural adaptation that is slightly different from previous Monster Hunter entries. Its silk-producing behaviour has been adjusted to reflect the specific environmental conditions of the Forbidden Lands. Where Nursilla in earlier games would typically construct webs using silk that dried in the relatively stable conditions of forest or cave habitats, the Wilds variant produces silk with a different surface chemistry that allows it to maintain structural integrity in the high wind, high mineral particulate environment of the regions it inhabits. Fact 39 is that the Wilds version of Nursilla has been subtly redesigned at a biological level to reflect the specific environmental pressures of the Forbidden Lands, a change that is visible in the texture of the silk it produces and the way that silk interacts with environmental particulates. The Quematrice is a firebird wyvern with a design that rewards attention to its anatomical details. Its head and neck ornamentation, the fanned crest structures, and the elaborate throat pouches are not purely aesthetic. They appear to function as both thermal regulation surfaces and as signalling structures used in intraspecies communication. The way Quematrice holds its crest structures in different configurations depending on its behavioural state, aggressive, alert, passive, communicating with members of its own species, is a consistent and readable behavioural language if you watch the monster long enough. Fact 40 is that Quematrice's elaborate head ornamentation serves a dual biological function as both thermoregulation structure and social signalling system, and the game implements this dual function through the monster's passive behavioural animations in a way that is consistent enough to constitute a learnable visual language. The Gypsaros returning in Wilds has an updated set of passive behaviours that make its social dynamics more apparent than in previous entries. Gypsaros typically lives in small groups with a dominant individual distinguished by the size and luminosity of its head crest photoreceptive organ. In Wilds, the social hierarchy within a Gypsaros group is more dynamically represented. The dominant individual actively maintains its position through regular crest-flashing displays directed at subordinate members of the group. When the dominant individual is absent from the group due to hunting or being drawn away by player activity, the remaining members show measurable behavioral changes consistent with reduced group cohesion. Fact 41 is that the Gypseros group dynamics in wilds are implemented with enough behavioral specificity that removing the dominant individual from a group scenario produces observable changes in the behavior of the remaining members. The Rathalos and Rathian in Monster Hunter Wilds are presented as a mated pair within the Forbidden Lands ecosystem, which is consistent with the franchise lore that has long established these two species as ecologically linked. But Wilds adds a detail to their relationship that is new. The territorial boundaries maintained by the Rathalos' aerial patrols and the Rathians' ground-based territory appear to be coordinated. Where Rathalos' aerial patrol ends, Rathian's ground patrol tends to begin, creating an interlocking coverage pattern that effectively doubles the total territory maintained by the pair. Fact 42 is that the Rathalos and Rathian in Wilds coordinate their territorial patrol behaviors to create a combined coverage pattern that neither could maintain individually, a detail that represents a more sophisticated implementation of their paired ecology than any previous Monster Hunter entry. Lala Barina, one of the smaller monsters in the Forbidden Lands, has a detail in its behavior that is disproportionately interesting, given its low-threat status in the game. The Lala Barina displays a courtship behavior that is only observable during specific weather conditions and at specific times of day. During this courtship display, the luminescent organs along its body produce a synchronized light pattern that is distinct from the individual flashing it uses in threat displays. If you observe multiple Lala Barina engaged in this courtship behavior simultaneously, the synchronization between individuals appears to follow a rhythmic pattern that is consistent from one occurrence to the next. Fact 43 is that the Lala Barina's courtship display implements a synchronized bioluminescent communication system that is mechanically distinct from its threat display, observable only under specific environmental conditions, and consistent enough in its timing pattern to suggest it is communicating specific information rather than simply broadcasting general availability. There is a territorial conflict dynamic in Wilds that produces some of the most interesting emergent behavior in the game. When two large monsters of similar power level encounter each other in a shared territory, the resolution of that conflict follows a set of behavioral rules that are more nuanced than a simple fight to the submission. Pre-conflict displays, including vocalizations, scent-marking behaviors visible in how the monster positions itself relative to landmark features, and direct visual intimidation postures precede physical engagement in most cases. The actual physical conflict, when it occurs, tends to be shorter than the pre-conflict display period, and the loser of the conflict shows a consistent behavioral sequence of withdrawal, followed by a period of reduced activity. Fact 44 is that Monster Hunter Wilds implements territorial conflict resolution with a full behavioral sequence, including pre-conflict display, conflict proper, and post-conflict recovery, rather than reducing monster fights to simple combat encounters with no behavioral context. The wound system in Monster Hunter Wilds, where specific body parts of a monster can be damaged and opened to create exploitable wound states, has a lore dimension that the game implies through monster behavior rather than explaining directly. When a monster develops a significant wound during a hunt, its behavior does not simply change in the mechanical ways the game communicates to the player. The monster also shows behavioral changes consistent with pain management and injury compensation in real animals. It redistributes its weight away from damaged limbs, modifies its attack patterns to reduce loading on compromised structures, and shows increased aggression consistent with a stress response to physical damage. Fact 45 is that the wound system in Wilds is implemented with behavioral responses to injury that are consistent with real animal pain management strategies, adding a layer of ecological authenticity to what is primarily a gameplay system. The cycret, the large insectoid creature that serves as the player's mount in Monster Hunter Wilds, has a biological design that is more sophisticated than its role as a transport animal might suggest. Its sensory apparatus, particularly the elaborate antennae structures and the apparent olfactory organs along its thorax, implies a tracking capability that goes well beyond basic scent following. The way Secret navigates complex terrain, finding paths through areas that the player character could not navigate independently, suggests either a spatial memory of the environment or a real-time sensory processing capability that generates navigational solutions on the fly. Fact 46 is that the Cycret's biological design implies a navigational intelligence that is significantly more sophisticated than its role as a mount would strictly require, which points toward the game designers building a creature with a convincing biological basis for its function rather than simply a conveniently mobile vehicle. The bond system between the player hunter and the Secret is reflected in the creature's behavioral responses over the course of the game. Early in the relationship, the Secret shows behavioral indicators of wariness around the hunter, specifically in how it holds its antennae relative to the hunter's position and how quickly it responds to directional cues. As the bond develops through sustained cooperative activity, these behavioral indicators shift toward ones consistent with trust and familiarity in social animals. The Cycret begins to anticipate the hunter's directional choices, positions itself to facilitate rapid mounting without being prompted, and shows reduced alertness indicators when in close proximity to the hunter. Fact 47 is that the Cycret's behavioral responses to the player-hunter change over the course of the game in ways that reflect a developing social bond, and this progression is implemented through the creature's animation set rather than through any explicit narrative acknowledgement. The way monsters respond to weather events in Wilds goes beyond simply seeking shelter or becoming more active. Each species has a specific suite of behaviours associated with each type of weather event it can encounter in its habitat, and these weather-specific behaviours are distinct from both the monster's standard active behaviour and its standard resting behaviour. During a windward plains inclemency storm, for example, Doshiguma packs do not simply shelter. They engage in a specific group behaviour where the pack arranges itself in a formation that positions larger individuals on the windward side of the group, effectively shielding smaller members from the direct force of the storm. Fact 48 is that monster weather response behaviours in Wilds are species-specific and socially nuanced, with group living species showing collective weather responses that reflect their social structure rather than simply individual shelter-seeking. Kongalala, the fanged beast that returns in Monster Hunter Wilds, has an updated set of feeding behaviours that reflect the specific flora of the Forbidden Lands. In previous games, Kongalala's feeding was fairly generic. In Wilds, the specific plants it feeds on in each biome and the digestive fermentation behaviours that result are tuned to the actual botanical composition of those biomes. Kongalala feeding in the Scarlet Forest shows different post-feeding behaviours than Kongalala feeding in other environments, consistent with the specific fermentation properties of the forest's distinctive plant chemistry. Fact 49 is that Kongalala's famous fermentation-based biology has been updated in Wilds to reflect the actual botanical chemistry of the biomes it inhabits. A level of biological specificity that most players will never notice, but that makes the creature's ecology feel consistent rather than arbitrary. The elder dragons in Wilds occupy a category in the ecosystem that is qualitatively different from non-elder dragon apex predators. They are not simply the largest or most powerful organisms in their respective biomes. They function as what ecologists might call keystone species, organisms whose presence or absence has disproportionate effects on the overall structure and function of the ecosystem. Jindahade's role in the thermal balance of the ice shard cliffs is one example. New Udra's role in the chemical cycling of the oil well basin is another. Uth Duna, the water elder dragon, appears to function as a pressure regulator in the underground water system that connects the biomes. Fact 50 is that the elder dragons of Monster Hunter Wilds are designed as keystone ecological actors rather than simply as powerful enemies, and understanding their ecological roles provides a framework for understanding why hunting them carries the lore weight that it does. Uth Duna's specific ecological role in the Forbidden Lands water system involves a behaviour that is genuinely unusual even within the context of elder dragon biology. The creature appears to actively travel the underground water channels between biomes on a cycle that corresponds roughly to the seasonal weather patterns of the Forbidden Lands. During this travel, it displaces large volumes of water between underground storage areas, effectively redistributing water from biomes that are in a wet phase to biomes that are in a dry phase. This redistribution behaviour has the effect of moderating the extremes of both drought and flooding in the surface biomes, essentially serving as a living hydraulic buffer system. Fact 51 is that Uth Duna functions as a hydraulic regulation organism in the Forbidden Lands water system, and its migration cycle through the underground water channels is the primary mechanism by which water is distributed across the biomes in a relatively stable long-term pattern. The Arkveld's chain-like weapons deserve more attention than they typically receive in the context of combat mechanics discussions. These structures, which the monster uses to grapple, drain, and redirect in combat, are not simply mechanical additions to a standard wyvern body plan. Their surface texture, the articulation points, and the apparent growth patterns visible in the base Arkveld versus the Guardian variant suggest these structures are biological in origin, grown by the Arkveld itself, but also potentially modified or augmented by environmental factors, possibly including the curio. Fact 52 is that the chain structures on Arkveld's body are biological growth products rather than external attachments, and their specific form in any given individual may reflect the environmental history of that individual, including any past curio exposure. The field guide entry for the base Arkveld, as opposed to the Guardian variant, uses language that is very carefully chosen. It describes Arkveld as an apex predator adapted to manage the flow of vital energy through the ecosystem. This is an unusual description. Most monster field guide entries describe predators in terms of prey species, hunting behaviours, and territorial characteristics. Describing Arkveld specifically in terms of managing vital energy flow suggests the game is using a specific conceptual framework for what this creature's ecological role is, one that goes beyond standard predator-prey relationships. Fact 53 is that Arkveld's field guide description positions it as a system-level ecological actor rather than simply an apex predator, and the specific language around vital energy management points toward a role in the ecosystem's energy cycling that is qualitatively different from any other monster in the Wilds roster. The smaller monsters of the Forbidden Lands often go unnoticed, but several of them have behavioural details that are worth pausing on. The small herbivores that populate the edges of the Windward Plains, in particular, have a predictive flight response that is more sophisticated than simple fear behaviour. They appear to respond not just to the direct proximity of predators, but to specific environmental cues that reliably precede predator arrival, changes in wind direction, specific bird calls from sentinel species in the canopy layer, subtle vibrations in the ground that correspond to a large creature moving at a distance beyond direct sensory range. Fact 54 is that the herbivore endemic life in Wilds has a predictive threat response system that uses environmental proxy cues rather than direct predator detection, which means observing endemic life flight behaviour can tell you about predator activity in adjacent areas before you have direct contact with the predator. The behaviour of the palicos in Monster Hunter Wilds contains several details that add to the lore of the game beyond their combat utility. Specific palico animations include independent exploration behaviors during moments when the hunter is stationary, moments where the palico examines specific environmental features, sniffs at tracks, or spends time near specific plants or mineral deposits. These behaviors are not random. They appear to be keyed to specific environmental features in the game world, and palicos consistently focus their independent exploration on locations that are lore significant. Fact 55 is that palico-independent exploration behaviors in wilds are environmentally keyed to lore significant locations, and paying attention to where your palico chooses to spend its idle time can function as a subtle environmental storytelling indicator. The way large monster corpses decompose in Monster Hunter Wilds, while simplified compared to a true biological simulation, has a temporal component that most players ignore. If you leave a hunt area and return to a location where a large monster died, the remains show a progression of decomposition state over time. More importantly, the scavenger species present at the remains change over this decomposition timeline. Early stages attract generalist scavengers. Later stages attract more specialist organisms, including some endemic life species that are only found at late-stage decomposition sites. Fact 56 is that Monster Hunter Wilds implements a decomposition timeline for large monster corpses with stage-specific scavenger assemblages, and visiting a decomposition site at different time intervals reveals different endemic life that is not accessible through any other means. Monster territorial behavior in wilds has a detail that relates to the ancient geography of the Forbidden Lands. Certain large monsters maintain territorial core areas that are centered not on the best current feeding grounds or the most defensible physical terrain, but on locations that appear to be archaeological or geological landmarks, specific rock formations, ancient constructed features in areas near the ruins of Wyveria, or geologically distinct ground-level features. This suggests that territorial behavior in some species is culturally transmitted, passed from parent to offspring through observation and reinforcement, rather than being purely instinctual. Fact 57 is that some monster species in wilds appear to inherit territorial core areas through cultural transmission rather than instinct, centering their territories on landmarks that have been significant to their lineage for potentially thousands of years. The final monster behavior fact for this chapter concerns what happens when a player hunter completes a hunt in a very specific manner. If you complete certain hunts without triggering any critical damage events, without using environmental traps, without using any of the wound exploitation mechanics, essentially completing the hunt in the most conservative and ecologically minimal way possible, several ambient creature species that would normally flee the area during combat remain present and continue their normal behaviors throughout the encounter. This appears to be the game rewarding ecologically minded hunting with an authentic ecosystem response, where the ecosystem does not overreact to a hunt that it registers as within the normal parameters of predation. Fact 58 is that Monster Hunter Wilds appears to have an ecosystem sensitivity system that registers how disruptive the player's hunting behavior is and adjusts the ambient wildlife response accordingly, rewarding low-impact hunting styles with a more authentic and intact ecosystem experience. Chapter 3: Ancient Civilizations and the Ruins of Wyveria. The ruins of Wyveria are not simply a biome in Monster Hunter Wilds. They are the answer to a question the game has been building since the opening sequences. Everything about the Forbidden Lands, the prohibition, the ecological complexity, the specific arrangement of biomes, the behavior of certain elder dragons, points toward the ruins as the reason for all of it. And the ruins themselves, once you reach them, are dense with details that the game distributes across field notes, architectural features, environmental storytelling, and item descriptions in a way that rewards sustained exploration. This chapter is about what the ruins are telling us if we are paying close enough attention. Fact 59 is that the ruins of Wyveria are the narrative and ecological centre of Monster Hunter Wilds, and almost every major lore thread in the game ultimately leads back to something visible or readable in the ruins themselves. The architecture of the ruins of Wyveria has a specific quality that separates it from ruins found in other Monster Hunter games. Most ruins in the franchise are clearly of human or Wyverian construction, using materials and techniques consistent with advanced but ultimately recognizable craft traditions. The Wyveria ruins combine recognizable architectural elements with structural features that have no clear functional explanation under standard construction logic. Certain wall surfaces appear to have been shaped by a process that left no tool marks. Certain load-bearing structures are oriented in ways that distribute weight in patterns inconsistent with gravity-based architecture. Fact 60 is that the ruins of Wyveria show evidence of construction techniques that do not correspond to standard material technology, which points toward either a level of technological sophistication beyond what the Wyverian people are typically credited with in franchise lore, or a fundamentally different approach to what architecture is supposed to do. The inscriptions visible throughout the ruins of Wyveria are rendered in a script that does not perfectly match any of the Wyverian writing systems seen in previous Monster Hunter games. It shares structural features with the Wyverian script seen in certain areas of the New World locations from Monster Hunter World, but with additional character forms that appear to be extensions or modifications of the standard system. This points toward the Wyveria inscriptions representing either an older form of Wyverian writing, one that predates the standardized system seen elsewhere, or a specialized variant developed specifically for recording the particular type of knowledge the Wyveria civilization was working with. Fact 61 is that the written language of the Wyveria ruins is a distinct variant of the broader Wyverian script tradition, and the differences between this variant and the standard form may carry information about the specific focus and historical period of the civilization that created it. One of the most frequently overlooked environmental details in the ruins of Wyveria is the orientation of certain structures relative to celestial geography. Specific archways and window openings in the ruins are oriented to admit light at very specific angles during very specific times of year, in a way that is clearly intentional rather than coincidental. These light alignment features correspond to, among other things, the seasonal positions of certain identifiable star patterns visible in the Monster Hunter night sky. The civilization that built Wyveria was doing careful astronomical observation and incorporating that observation into their architecture. Fact 62 is that the ruins of Wyveria contain embedded astronomical alignments, which means the builders of Wyveria were systematic celestial observers whose astronomical knowledge was sophisticated enough to be encoded in permanent architectural form. The ecological chambers in the lower levels of the Wyveria ruins are perhaps the most extraordinary environmental storytelling achievement in the game. These are sections of the ruins that appear to have been designed not merely as spaces for human activity, but as controlled ecological environments. The infrastructure for water flow, the preserved botanical material still growing in certain sections after what must be an enormous span of time, the specifically designed apertures for light and ventilation, all suggest spaces intended to maintain living ecosystems in a controlled and observable state. Fact 63 is that portions of the ruins of Wyveria appear to have been designed as controlled ecological observation chambers, and the civilization that built them was engaged in what amounts to systematic ecological science at a scale and sophistication that goes well beyond anything else documented in Monster Hunter franchise lore. The relationship between the Wyverian people and the monsters of the Forbidden Lands is one of the central mysteries of Wilds, and the ruins provide several pieces of evidence that point in a specific direction. Unlike ruins in previous games that show evidence of monster-related conflict, defensive structures, and weapon caches, the Wyveria ruins show a pattern of cohabitation indicators. Monster scale and bone deposits in areas of the ruins that were clearly inhabited spaces, not hunting dumps or waste disposal areas, but living quarters and communal spaces. This suggests the Wyverian people of this civilization had a relationship with certain monster species that was far more integrated than simple hunting and harvesting. Fact 64 is that the ruins of Wyveria suggest the civilization that built them maintained a cohabitative relationship with certain monster species rather than a purely exploitative one, which represents a radical departure from the predator-managing role that guild culture assigns to hunters. There are specific locations in the ruins of Wyveria where you can find what appear to be records of ecological data. These are not merely inscriptions or carvings, but structured arrangements of marks that function like tabular records when examined carefully. The data encoded in these records corresponds in some cases to observations that match the current ecological state of the Forbidden Lands, suggesting the records predate any disruption that changed the region's ecology. In other cases, the records appear to document ecological states that no longer exist in the Forbidden Lands, species and conditions that do not correspond to anything currently observable. Fact 65 is that the ruins of Wyveria contain ecological records that document both the pre-disruption state of the Forbidden Lands and possibly conditions that existed even earlier, creating a layered ecological history that the Wyverian civilization was actively tracking over a very long time period. The structural damage visible in the ruins is not uniform. Certain sections of the ruins show damage consistent with monster activity, the kind of physical impact patterns that large monsters leave on stone surfaces, but other sections show a different type of damage that is harder to categorize. Some areas appear to have experienced thermal events of an intensity beyond what even Elder Dragonfire would typically produce. Some areas show stress fractures consistent with localized but extremely powerful seismic events. And certain sections, particularly in the deepest accessible areas of the ruins, show damage patterns that resemble what you would expect from a directed energy event of some kind. Fact 66 is that the ruins of Wyveria were damaged by multiple distinct catastrophic events of different types, each leaving its own physical signature, which suggests the end of the Wyveria civilization was not a single event, but a sequence of escalating disasters. The Wyverian people in Monster Hunter franchise lore are long-lived by nature, and the ruins of Wyveria provide evidence that this community was active for an extremely long time relative to other documented Wyverian communities. The architectural stratification of the ruins shows multiple distinct construction phases, each using slightly different techniques and materials, but maintaining a consistent overarching architectural philosophy. The number of distinct construction phases visible in the ruins suggests continuous occupation and development over a time span that dwarfs most documented civilizations in the franchise. Fact 67 is that the Wyveria community appears to have maintained continuous occupation of this site for a period significantly longer than any other documented Wyverian community, making the ruins not just architecturally complex, but historically deep in a way that most Monster Hunter civilizations simply are not. The presence of Wyverian script inside the ruins describing what appears to be the curio is one of the most significant lore details in the game. The description matches the curio in several specific biological details, including references to their capacity for life force absorption and their tendency to aggregate in large groups around powerful organisms. This means the Wyverian civilization of Wyveria was aware of the curio before whatever catastrophe ended their community. More than aware, the records suggest they had been studying the curio for an extended period. Fact 68 is that the Wyverian civilization of Wyveria had documented knowledge of the curio, and the level of detail in those records suggests systematic long-term study rather than incidental observation, which raises the possibility that the curio were a subject of deliberate research rather than simply an ecological hazard. There are structures in the ruins that appear to be purpose-built containment facilities. The physical characteristics of these structures, reinforced walls, specific aperture designs that would prevent exit while allowing monitoring, and what appear to be environmental control systems in an advanced state of disrepair, are consistent with spaces designed to hold living organisms under controlled conditions for extended periods. Fact 69 is that the ruins of Wyveria contain what appears to be biological containment infrastructure, and the scale of these containment facilities, some capable of housing very large organisms based on their dimensions, points toward a research program that was working with large living specimens, possibly including monsters of significant size and power. The artworks preserved in certain protected alcoves of the ruins provide a visual record of the Wyveria civilization's self-image and cultural priorities that is separate from and complementary to the written records. The artworks consistently depict specific monster species in a reverential rather than triumphalist context. Where many human and Wyverian cultures throughout the franchise depict monster hunting as conquest, the Wyveria artworks show monsters in positions of power and centrality, with smaller Wyverian figures arranged in observational or participatory postures rather than combat stances. Fact 70 is that the visual culture of the Wyveria civilization depicted monsters as central and powerful rather than as subjects of conquest, suggesting their relationship with the monster ecosystem was fundamentally different from guild hunter culture in its underlying philosophy. The light manipulation technology implied by certain architectural features in the ruins deserves its own detailed discussion. There are surfaces throughout the deeper sections of the ruins that appear to be designed as light guiding systems, directing and concentrating natural light from surface apertures down into the deepest interior spaces. The material these surfaces are made of has a light transmission property that is not found in any currently craftable material in the game, suggesting either a lost manufacturing technology or a material sourced from a species or geological context that no longer exists. Fact 71 is that the ruins of Wyveria incorporate a light guidance technology that cannot be replicated with current materials available in the game, and this technological gap is itself a piece of lore suggesting the Wyveria civilization had access to resources or processes that have since been lost. The underground sections of the ruins connect to the same underground water system that links the other biomes of the Forbidden Lands, but they also connect to a set of passages that do not lead to any other biome. These passages, which appear to be deliberate constructions rather than natural cave formations, lead downward toward a geological depth consistent with the upper mantle of the planet's crust. Their purpose is not explained anywhere in the game's text. Fact 72 is that the ruins of Wyveria include constructed passages that descend to a depth inconsistent with any practical, architectural, or ecological purpose. And the nature of these passages is one of the most genuinely unresolved mysteries in the game's lore, deliberately placed as an unresolved question. The monster ecology around the ruins of Wyveria is distinct from the ecology of the other biomes in a way that reflects the ruins' unique history. Certain monsters found in the ruins area show behavioral adaptations to human-constructed environments, specifically a familiarity with enclosed spaces, an ability to navigate architectural structures, and territorial behaviors key to constructed landmarks rather than natural features. This suggests these species have lived among the ruins for long enough that the ruins have become a fundamental environmental feature for them, rather than an anomalous human artifact in an otherwise natural landscape. Fact 73 is that certain monster species in the ruins area have adapted their behavior specifically to the constructed environment of the ruins over a very long period of cohabitation, effectively treating the ancient architecture as a natural feature of their habitat. The specific location of the ruins of Wyveria within the broader geography of the Forbidden Lands, at the convergence point of all 5 biomes, as described in the first chapter, appears to have been chosen for a reason that goes beyond simple geographic convenience. There is evidence in the ecological observation records preserved in the ruins that the builders were specifically interested in studying the interactions between biomes at the convergence points. The ruins are positioned at the one location in the Forbidden Lands where the atmospheric, hydrological, and biological flows from all 5 biomes intersect simultaneously. Fact 74 is that the ruins of Wyveria were deliberately built at the ecological convergence point of the Forbidden Lands as part of a research program specifically designed to study biome interaction effects, and the civilization's scientific purpose was inseparable from its geographic positioning. The Wyverian people who built these ruins left behind personal artifacts in some of the more protected interior spaces. These items, which range from what appear to be personal writing implements to small decorative objects, tell a human story underneath the civilization-level narrative. The decorative objects, in particular, show artistic traditions that reference specific monster species in a personalized way, individual Wyverian craftspeople depicting specific monsters in styles that suggest personal relationships with those species rather than cultural or religious abstraction. Fact 75 is that personal artifacts in the ruins suggest individual Wyverian members of this civilization maintain specific ongoing relationships with particular monster species that were personal and idiosyncratic rather than purely cultural or institutional, which adds a deeply human dimension to what is otherwise a grand historical mystery. The decay state of organic material in the ruins, compared to the expected decay rate for materials of their apparent composition over the implied time frame of the ruins' abandonment, suggests something unusual about the preservation environment. Certain organic materials that should have decomposed completely over the span of time the ruins appear to have been abandoned are still present in recognizable form. This anomalous preservation could reflect unusual atmospheric chemistry in the deep interior of the ruins, or it could reflect some property of the ruins' construction materials that retards decomposition. Fact 76 is that the ruins of Wyveria show anomalous organic preservation rates that cannot be explained by standard environmental factors, and one possible reading is that the construction materials themselves were specifically chosen or processed to create a preservation-favourable microenvironment within the interior spaces. There are sections of the ruins that show evidence of deliberate demolition rather than catastrophic destruction. Specific structural elements, doorways, access passages, load-bearing walls, in certain configurations, appear to have been removed or collapsed in a controlled manner rather than by external force. This demolition evidence suggests the final inhabitants of the ruins took deliberate action to restrict access to specific areas before or during the abandonment of the site. Fact 77 is that the last inhabitants of the ruins of Wyveria appear to have deliberately sealed or destroyed certain access points before leaving, which implies they had reasons to prevent future entry into specific areas and the time and capability to act on those reasons before the final end of the community. The Wyverian inscription that appears above the primary entrance to the deepest accessible section of the ruins is one of the most analysed pieces of text in the Monster Hunter Wilds community. The translation is contested in some details, but the general meaning points towards something along the lines of a warning about the consequences of proceeding. What makes this interesting from a law perspective is the specific nature of the warning. It does not warn against monsters or physical danger. It warns against what could be translated as forcing completion of an incomplete process. This is a very specific and unusual thing to carve above an entrance. Fact 78 is that the ruins of Wyveria's deepest section is marked with a warning against interfering with an ongoing process rather than against physical danger, which suggests the Wyverian civilization was aware that whatever they started in the deep section of the ruins was not finished when they left. The relationship between the ruins of Wyveria and the broader First Wyverian lore that runs through the Monster Hunter franchise is one of the more ambitious lore connections Wilds makes. The first Wyverian figure who appears in various games as an ancient observer is not explicitly confirmed in Wilds as having any connection to the Wyveria civilization, but the phrasing of certain inscriptions in the ruins uses grammatical constructions consistent with singular authorship rather than institutional declaration. This suggests certain inscriptions in the ruins were written by a single individual rather than as community edicts. Fact 79 is that some inscriptions in the ruins of Wyveria appear to have been composed by a single individual using a personal rather than institutional voice, and this individual's perspective is distinct from the communal records in ways that suggest significant personal experience with the subjects being described. The ruins do not contain any remains of the Wyverian people who once lived there. In a site of this scale and apparent occupation density, the complete absence of skeletal remains is genuinely unusual. Either the inhabitants left before dying and the deaths occurred elsewhere, or there is a cultural or practical explanation for why no remains are present in the ruins themselves. The field notes available in the game suggest the survey team researchers made note of this absence and found it significant. Fact 80 is that the complete absence of biological remains in the ruins of Wyveria is itself a lore detail, and the most interesting interpretations of this absence involve either a planned departure or a burial tradition so thorough and systematic that it left no trace, both of which suggest the end of the Wyveria community was not sudden or violent, but deliberate and organised. The ecological systems within and around the ruins appear to have been maintained in something close to the state the Wyverian inhabitants designed, despite the apparent absence of any active management for a very long time. The garden-like ecological chambers still function because the systems designed to maintain them, water flow structures, light guidance systems, ventilation designs, have persisted largely intact. This means the Wyverian civilization built ecological maintenance infrastructure specifically designed to outlast active human management. Fact 81 is that the ecological systems of the ruins of Wyveria were engineered for long-term autonomous operation, which means the civilization that built them was planning for a scenario where no one would be present to maintain them, a design choice that implies they knew their active occupation of the site might end. The specific distribution of different types of written records in the ruins tells a story about what the Wyverian inhabitants prioritized for preservation versus what they expected to remain accessible through ongoing use. The most extensively documented and multiply-copied inscriptions deal with ecological observation protocols and what appears to be a set of instructions for something that requires multiple participants. Single-copy personal notations deal with the specific findings and interpretations of individual researchers. Fact 82 is that the Wyveria ruins show a records management system designed to distinguish between foundational protocols meant for long-term preservation and individual research findings expected to be actively used by a functioning community, and the distribution of document types provides a map of what the civilization considered essential versus what they considered operational. There are astronomical records in the ruins that, if the calendar system can be correctly translated, describe celestial events that occurred in the past and also project forward into what, from the perspective of the record's composition, was the future. Some of these projected events correspond to time periods that, relative to the implied abandonment of the ruins, have since occurred. Others project still further forward. Fact 83 is that the Wyveria astronomical records include forward projections of celestial events, some of which have now occurred relative to the implied timeline of the game, and others of which project into the future of the game's present, suggesting the Wyverian civilization's astronomical projections may serve as a timeline for events still to come in the franchise narrative. The mineral composition of the construction materials in the deepest section of the ruins is distinct from the materials used in the upper sections. Specifically, the deep section materials contain trace elements not found in any surface geological deposit in the Forbidden Lands, suggesting they were either sourced from an extraordinary depth, imported from outside the region, or produced through a material processing technique that synthesized them from non-obvious precursors. Fact 84 is that the construction materials of the ruins' deepest section were sourced from outside the Forbidden Lands, or produced through an unknown synthesis process, making the deep section architecture materially distinct from, and potentially more technologically advanced than the upper sections that dominate most of the ruins' visible extent. The relationship between the ruins and the curio is documented in more detail than any other monster civilization relationship in the ruins' records. The level of detail in these records suggests the Wyveria civilization was not merely studying the curio as a biological curiosity. They appear to have been attempting to understand the curio's relationship with a specific type of vital energy the records describe, a concept that appears repeatedly in the deepest and most carefully preserved inscriptions. Fact 85 is that the Wyveria civilization's primary research interest, based on the distribution and preservation priority of their records, was the vital energy system that the curio interact with, and the scale of their research investment suggests they believed this system was central to the functioning of the entire Forbidden Lands ecosystem. There is a chamber in the deepest accessible section of the ruins that appears to have been the center of whatever the civilization's primary research project was. The architecture of this chamber is unlike anything else in the ruins, designed around a central open space rather than the functional subdivision that characterizes most of the ruins' interior design. The walls of this chamber are covered in the most densely inscribed text in the entire ruins, and several of the item descriptions for components found in this chamber use language pointing toward the idea that this space was the final location where the civilization's most advanced work was being conducted. Fact 86 is that the central chamber of the ruins' deepest section was the operational center of the Wyveria civilization's most important research, and the density of records in that chamber, compared to anywhere else in the ruins, reflects the concentration of their best effort and most advanced knowledge in a single location. The final point about the ruins for this chapter concerns what the architecture is not doing. For a civilization that appears to have had the technical sophistication to implement astronomical alignments, engineered ecological chambers, and an advanced writing system, the ruins are conspicuously free of anything that could be interpreted as a fortification or a weapon storage area. There are no defensible positions built into the architecture. There are no spaces consistent with weapons, manufacture, or storage. Whatever the Wyveria civilization was doing in the Forbidden Lands, they were not primarily concerned with conflict. Fact 87 is that the complete absence of military architecture or weapons infrastructure in the ruins of Wyveria suggests the civilization that built it was organized entirely around a research or stewardship mission rather than territorial defense, which makes their apparent disappearance simultaneously more mysterious and more poignant. Chapter 4. The Curio and the Guardian Phenomenon. The Curio are one of the more carefully constructed ecological mysteries in recent Monster Hunter history. They appear in Monster Hunter Rise as well as in Wilds, but the two games present them in contexts that are different enough to raise genuine questions about whether the Curio in both games are the same species operating in different contexts, or related but distinct phenomena sharing a biological lineage. Wilds provides more detail about the Curio's basic biology than Rise did, and that additional detail makes the connections to Rise more interesting rather than less. Fact 88 is that the Curio in Monster Hunter Wilds are presented with enough new biological detail to retroactively complicate the simpler framing they were given in Rise, and the most interesting reading of the two games' Curio lore treats them as parts of a single, continuing story rather than independent narrative elements. The physical description of the Curio in Wilds Field guide entries emphasizes several biological details that are not present in Rise's treatment. The Curio are described as existing in a state that is ambiguous between living organisms and something more complex, a biological entity with metabolic processes and behavioral patterns, but also with properties that suggest they are interfacing with a system larger than their individual biology. The description uses language consistent with organisms that function as nodes in a network rather than as independent biological units. Fact 89 is that the field guide description of the Curio in Wilds frames them as networked biological entities rather than independent organisms, which is a fundamentally different conceptual framing than treating them as simply a parasitic species, and this framing opens up interpretive possibilities about what the Curio network is and what it is networked to. The way Curio aggregate around powerful organisms is described in Wilds with more precision than in Rise. Specifically, the aggregation behavior is tied to a measurable quality of the host organism, something the field notes describe as the vitality signature or vital aura of the organism. Stronger, healthier, more ecologically dominant organisms attract larger Curio aggregations. This creates a biological paradox. The most ecologically important organisms in a given area are simultaneously the most attractive Curio targets, meaning the Curio aggregation behavior systematically targets the keystones of the ecosystem. Fact 90 is that the Curio's host attraction mechanism targets the most ecologically significant organisms in any given area first, which means an unchecked Curio population would systematically dismantle an ecosystem from the top down, beginning with the apex predators and keystone species and working downward through the food web. The scarlet blight, which is the most visible manifestation of Curio activity on a large scale, is not simply a color change or a corruption status. In ecological terms, it functions as a signal that the Curio network in an area has reached a threshold level of activity where the aggregate drain on vital energy exceeds the ecosystem's capacity to replenish it through normal biological processes. Below that threshold, the Curio exist without producing the visible blight effect. Above it, the excess vital energy drainage exceeds what organisms can absorb and process, and the overflow manifests as the visible red coloration associated with the blight. Fact 91 is that the scarlet blight is the visual indicator of a vital energy deficit in the ecosystem rather than the cause of ecological damage, and the areas of most intense blight coloration are the areas of greatest ecological stress rather than the areas of greatest Curio density. The guardian monsters, organisms that have been modified by Curio infestation to a point of enhancement rather than simple depletion, represent a paradox in the Curio's otherwise straightforward ecological role. If the Curio drain vital energy from their hosts, how does a guardian monster end up stronger rather than weaker? The field guide resolution of this paradox is subtle. Guardian monsters are not simply infested by curio. They are organisms that have established a metabolic feedback relationship with the curio, where instead of being drained, they are being amplified. The curio attached to a guardian monster appear to be functioning in reverse relative to their standard behavior, inputting vital energy rather than extracting it. Fact 92 is that guardian monsters are organisms that have reversed the standard curio energy relationship, receiving amplification rather than experiencing drain. And understanding this reversal is the key to understanding why guardian monsters are ecologically distinct from simple heavily infested organisms. The process by which an organism becomes a guardian monster, rather than simply being depleted by curio infestation, is not fully explained in the game's text. But the evidence available suggests it requires both a specific biological compatibility with the curio's energy interface and a sufficient baseline vitality to survive the initial infestation at high density. Most organisms that encounter a curio aggregation at high density are simply overwhelmed and depleted. An organism with both the right biological architecture and the baseline vitality to survive initial high-density infestation appears to have the possibility of entering the feedback relationship that creates the guardian state. Fact 93 is that becoming a guardian monster requires both biological compatibility and sufficient baseline vitality, which means the guardian phenomenon is not random. It selects for specific biological profiles, and the species capable of becoming guardian monsters are those with the specific combination of vitality and biological architecture that allows the curio reversal relationship to establish itself. Guardian Arkfeld is the clearest expression of the guardian phenomenon at its most developed. Every other guardian monster in the game shows modifications that enhance specific existing capabilities. Guardian Arkfeld appears to have been modified at a deeper level, with changes that suggest the curio have been integrated into the organism's functioning at a systemic rather than appendage-specific level. The vital energy cycling behavior of Guardian Arkfeld, specifically its ability to drain and redirect vital energy from multiple sources simultaneously, implies an infrastructure of curio integration that has become genuinely part of the organism's metabolism rather than an external layer. Fact 94 is that Guardian Arkfeld represents a stage of curio integration so deep that the organism and the curio network are functionally a single entity rather than a host and parasite. And this level of integration is qualitatively different from what is observable in other guardian monsters. The visual changes in guardian monsters, compared to their base forms, carry specific lore information beyond the general indicator of curio infestation. The coloration changes, which trend toward crimson and dark red tones in all guardian variants, correspond to the visual signature of the scarlet blight and suggest the guardian monsters are actively interfacing with the blight system at a cellular level. The structural modifications, the additional growth processes, reinforced tissue, and new appendage formations reflect the specific biological enhancement pathways that each species' curio integration has taken. Fact 95 is that the visual modifications of guardian monsters are not cosmetic. They are biological records of the specific enhancement processes the curio integration has driven in each host organism, and reading those visual modifications provides accurate information about what the guardian variant of a given monster can do that the base form cannot. The curio's behavior around the ruins of Wyveria is different from their behavior elsewhere in the Forbidden Lands. Elsewhere, curio aggregations tend to be dynamic, moving with or toward host organisms. In and around the ruins, curio appear in both mobile and stationary configurations. Stationary curio clusters in the ruins remain fixed in position, regardless of nearby host organisms, clustered around specific architectural features rather than living targets. This suggests the curio are responding to something in the ruins architecture itself, something that produces a stimulus for curio clustering that is independent of biological vital energy. Fact 96 is that the ruins of Wyveria produce a non-biological curio attractant, something in the architecture or materials of the ruins that stimulates curio clustering independent of living hosts, which points toward the Wyverian civilization having either built with curio-attractive materials deliberately or accidentally having incorporated something that produces a curio-relevant stimulus. The historical relationship between the curio and the Wyveria civilization, as discussed in the previous chapter, takes on additional significance when considered alongside the behavioral anomalies described above. If the curio cluster around the ruins in a stationary manner not exhibited elsewhere, and if the Wyverian records show extensive research into the curio, the most parsimonious explanation is that the ruins were built to interact with the curio in specific ways. The stationary clustering behavior at architectural features may be the intended outcome of a deliberate design choice, with the architecture functioning as a curio interface system of some kind. Fact 97 is that the stationary curio clustering behavior in the ruins may be an intended outcome of the ruins' architectural design, meaning the Wyverian civilization built structures specifically capable of engaging the curio at a systemic level. The rate of curio reproduction in the Forbidden Lands is implicitly documented through the progression of blight states during the game's timeline. Early in the game, the blight is present, but not overwhelming in most areas. Over the course of the main quest, the blight intensity increases in a pattern consistent with population growth toward a carrying capacity that is itself being elevated by guardian monster activity. The guardian monsters, by reversing the normal curio-drain relationship, appear to be net contributors to the curio population in a way that base organisms are not, effectively acting as curio amplifiers that accelerate the population growth toward critical density. Fact 98 is that guardian monsters are not simply enhanced prey equivalents from the perspective of the curio network. They are amplification nodes that accelerate curio population growth, and the presence of even one or two guardian monsters in a region can dramatically accelerate the timeline to critical blight density. The way the Scarlet Blight interacts with the broader ecology of the Forbidden Lands has a detail that is easy to miss in the visual intensity of high blight areas. Under blight conditions, the endemic life of the affected area does not simply disappear. Different species respond to elevated blight intensity in different ways. Some species show behavioral stress indicators and reduce their active range. Others appear largely unaffected, and a small number of species actually increase in density in high blight areas, apparently exploiting some resource produced by the blight conditions themselves. Fact 99 is that the Scarlet Blight creates a differential response in the endemic life assemblage, with some species negatively affected, some unaffected, and some positively benefiting from blight conditions, which means the blight is ecologically reorganizing the community rather than simply destroying it. The specific endemic life species that benefit from blight conditions have a visual characteristic in common. They display reddish pigmentation in their normal state that appears to intensify under blight conditions. This suggests these species have a metabolic pathway that allows them to process the form of vital energy overflow associated with the Scarlet Blight rather than being harmed by it. In other words, the blight's overflow energy is a food source for these species. Fact 100 is that certain endemic life species in the Forbidden Lands are adapted to metabolize the vital energy overflow that manifests as the Scarlet Blight, effectively functioning as a biological cleanup system for the blight's energy excess, and the evolutionary history of this adaptation suggests blight events have occurred repeatedly in this ecosystem for a very long time. The curio's interaction with the frenzy virus, introduced through Gore Magala's presence in the Forbidden Lands, appears to produce an emergent effect that neither pathogen produces independently. The specific monsters in the Forbidden Lands that show simultaneous curio presence and frenzy virus exposure display a modification state that is distinct from standard Guardian monsters and from frenzy state monsters in the traditional sense. Fact 101 is that the simultaneous presence of curio and frenzy virus in the Forbidden Lands ecosystem creates interaction effects that produce a novel modification state not seen in either pathogen's independent expression, and the specific nature of this combined state is one of the more carefully obscured mysteries in the game's lore. The curio appear to have a behavior that is activated by the presence of elder dragons specifically. When an elder dragon enters a high curio density area, the local curio population shows a directional response, orienting toward the elder dragon across distances that exceed what direct sensory detection would explain. This directional long-range response suggests the curio are detecting something about elder dragons at a distance, possibly the same vital energy signature that makes them attractive as hosts, but amplified to a range beyond what standard biological sensory systems could support. Fact 102 is that the curio have a long-range detection capability for elder dragons specifically that exceeds the limits of standard biological sensory systems, which implies they are detecting elder dragons through a mechanism other than sight, smell, or vibration, possibly through the vital energy signature itself at a distance. The relationship between the curio network and the concept of vital energy in Wild's lore raises a question that the game deliberately does not answer. What happens to the vital energy the curio absorb from non-guardian hosts? If the guardian relationship involves cycling energy back to the host, the standard drain relationship must output that energy somewhere. The curio cannot simply store unlimited quantities of vital energy given their small physical size. One possible reading of the lore is that the curio are functioning as vital energy transfer agents, moving energy from depleted organisms to a central repository of some kind, and that repository is what the ruins of Wyveria was built around. Fact 103 is that the fate of vital energy absorbed by non-guardian curio is one of the most significant unresolved questions in Wild's lore, and the most architecturally consistent reading of the evidence places a central vital energy storage or processing system somewhere in the depths of the ruins. The curio's effect on monster behavior, independent of the guardian transformation, is worth examining separately. Monsters in high curio density areas without crossing the guardian threshold show subtle behavioral changes that are distinct from both their normal behavior and the dramatic changes associated with guardian transformation. They become more territorial, more aggressive at shorter ranges, and their sleep and rest behaviors are compressed or eliminated in ways consistent with sustained sympathetic nervous system activation. Fact 104 is that chronic low-level curio presence below the guardian threshold produces sustained stress state effects in affected monsters, effectively pushing them toward permanent high-alert behavioral profiles that compromise their long-term ecological functioning. The pattern of curio distribution across the Forbidden Lands, when mapped relative to the biome positions and the location of the ruins, reveals a gradient of density that increases toward the ruins. The highest curio densities in the game are consistently found in and around the ruins of Wyveria, with density decreasing roughly with distance from that central location. This gradient is consistent with the ruins being either the source of the curio population or the location of whatever is sustaining and amplifying the population. Fact 105 is that the curio population in the Forbidden Lands is organized around a density gradient centered on the ruins of Wyveria, which is the strongest piece of evidence that the ruins are the ecological epicenter of the curio phenomenon, rather than simply a location where they happen to be present. The way curio respond to the player hunter over the course of the game has a subtle progression that is easy to miss. Early in the game, Curio do not appear to target the hunter specifically. They are present in the environment and cause incidental contact damage, but they do not prioritize the hunter as a high-value target. Later in the game, after the hunter has completed several significant hunts and presumably increased their personal vitality signature through combat experience, Curio in the environment begins showing directional orientation toward the hunter at range, similar to the elder dragon response described above. Fact 106 is that the Curio begin targeting the player hunter specifically as the game progresses, with the transition point appearing to correspond to the hunter reaching a vitality significance threshold that makes them an attractive target, which creates a gameplay narrative feedback loop, where becoming a more powerful hunter simultaneously makes you more of a target for the ecosystem's primary threat. The Curio have a dormancy state that is documented in the field notes, but rarely observable in gameplay because it requires finding Curio at a specific location during a specific time window. During periods of inclemency in the ruins biome specifically, Curio that are in the exposed portions of the ruins appear to enter a quiescent state where they reduce their activity and cluster more tightly. The dormancy response appears to be triggered not by temperature or atmospheric pressure directly, but by something specific to inclemency events in the ruins context. Fact 107 is that the Curio have a dormancy response to ruins-specific inclemency events, which points toward the Curio having a biological relationship with whatever phenomenon produces the ruins biome's inclemency, rather than simply responding to generic adverse weather. The size distribution of Curio in different parts of the Forbidden Lands is not uniform. Curio in the ruins tend to be slightly larger on average than Curio found in the peripheral biomes. This size difference, while subtle, is biologically significant because it implies the Curio nearest the ruins are the most developed specimens in the population, which is consistent with the ruins being the most resource-rich location for Curio development. If the vital energy available to Curio is highest at the ruins, the Curio at the ruins would grow larger and develop more fully than those at the periphery of the population's range. Fact 108 is that the size gradient of Curio in the Forbidden Lands, with largest specimens found at the ruins and progressively smaller specimens at greater distances, is consistent with the ruins being the vital energy resource optimum for the Curio population. Guardian monsters do not appear to be capable of further transformation once the Guardian state is established. Or rather, the game presents Guardian status as a stable end state for most species. But Guardian Arkveld appears to exist in a category that is still actively developing, showing progressive physical changes over the course of the game that suggest the deep Curio integration in that individual is ongoing rather than having reached a stable equilibrium. Fact 109 is that Guardian Arkveld, unlike other Guardian monsters, appears to be in an actively developing transformation state, rather than a stable endpoint, which makes it not just the most powerful Guardian monster, but potentially a preview of what the Guardian phenomenon looks like when pushed to its full developmental extent. The behavioral relationship between Guardian Arkveld and the Curio population as a whole appears to be hierarchical. The Curio in the Forbidden Lands show a directional orientation toward Guardian Arkveld that is different in quality from their orientation toward other powerful organisms. Where the Elder Dragon response resembles attraction, the Guardian Arkveld response resembles deference. Local Curio populations appear to yield to Guardian Arkveld's movement, clearing its path rather than clustering around it, as they would around a standard high vitality target. Fact 110 is that Guardian Arkveld commands a form of behavioral deference from the Curio population that no other organism in the Forbidden Lands receives, suggesting it occupies a specific hierarchical position within the Curio network rather than simply being the most powerful host. The lore connections between the Curio in Wilds and the Curio in Rise are explicit enough to confirm they are related phenomena, but the specific relationship is left ambiguous. The curio in Rise were associated with the black blight affecting the rampage monsters, while the Wilds curio produced the scarlet blight. The colour difference is potentially significant. The black blight and scarlet blight may represent different stages or modes of the same underlying phenomenon. Fact 111 is that the colour distinction between the black blight of Rise and the scarlet blight of Wilds may indicate a difference in the developmental stage or operational mode of the curio phenomenon, with one possible reading being that the two colours represent two different phases of a cycle that has not been fully observed in any single game. The curio's apparent capacity to function as a network, sharing information or vital energy between individual members of the aggregate, is implied by the coordinated behaviour of curio groups during Guardian transformation events. When a Guardian monster is in the process of becoming established, the curio participating in that transformation coordinate their positioning and behaviour in a way that suggests real-time communication between individuals rather than parallel independent responses to the same stimulus. Fact 112 is that curio demonstrate network-level coordinated behaviour during Guardian transformation events, implying inter-individual communication capability that conventional biological sensory mechanisms would struggle to explain at the speed and precision observable. The ecological cost of the curio phenomenon in the Forbidden Lands is visible in the survey data available through field notes and Alma's research records. Areas of the Forbidden Lands that have been under sustained high curio presence for an extended period show measurable reductions in biodiversity, plant density, and endemic life activity relative to comparable areas in the peripheral biomes. The blight is not merely a visual indicator, it corresponds to a genuine ecological degradation that is quantitatively documentable in species counts and biomass estimates. Fact 113 is that the scarlet blight represents real and measurable ecological degradation in the Forbidden Lands, with affected areas showing quantifiable biodiversity loss that accumulates over time with continued curio presence, making the blight not just a monster enhancement mechanic, but a genuine ecological emergency. The question of whether the curio themselves have a consciousness, or something resembling awareness, is raised carefully and without resolution in the game's text. The field notes describe behaviours that are challenging to explain through instinct alone, specifically the curio's apparent adaptive responses to novel situations that arise during the game's events. They respond to the hunter, to the Guardian transformation process, and to the ruins architecture in ways that suggest some capacity for contextual learning. Fact 114 is that the curio display behavioural flexibility in novel situations that is more consistent with some form of contextual learning than with purely instinctual, programmed responses, and the game presents this as an open question, rather than resolving it in either direction. The curio's relationship to the concept of vital energy in the game's cosmology connects to older threads in the Monster Hunter franchise that have always been present but rarely foregrounded. The idea of vital energy as a real and movable quantity in the Monster Hunter world, separate from but related to the more explicit elemental energy systems, runs through the franchise in the concept of dragon energy, the curio's drain mechanics, and various elder dragon biologies. Wilds is the first game to make this energy concept the central narrative concern, using the curio and the Guardian phenomenon as a lens through which to examine it. Fact 115 is that Monster Hunter Wilds is the most explicit treatment the franchise has yet given to vital energy as a distinct cosmological category, using the curio crisis as a vehicle for developing a concept that has been implicit in franchise lore for the entire series' history. The final curio fact for this chapter concerns the moment in the game when the player first encounters a curio cluster that does not respond to the hunter's presence at all. In most of the game, Curio respond to nearby organisms, including the hunter, but there is a location, discoverable through exploration rather than being directed there by the main quest, where a Curio cluster remains completely static and unresponsive regardless of what occurs in its immediate vicinity. This cluster is positioned in a specific architectural location in the ruins in a way that suggests it is in the middle of a process that has been interrupted or suspended. Fact 116 is that there is a suspended Curio cluster in the ruins that has been paused in an intermediate state of activity for an indeterminate period, and the architectural context of its location points toward this being the physical remnant of the most advanced stage of the Wyverian civilization's Curio research. Chapter 5: Weapons, Armor, and Crafting Secrets. The weapon and armor system in Monster Hunter Wilds carries more lore per square centimeter of text than almost any other element of the game. Item descriptions, the flavor text on craftable gear, the names chosen for specific weapon tiers within each tree, and the visual design choices embedded in finished gear all function as a secondary narrative that runs parallel to the main story. Most players read item descriptions once, if at all, and focus on the stats, but the descriptions are doing real narrative work, and the choices made in designing each weapon and armor set reflect an enormous amount of thought about how craft traditions develop in a world defined by the relationship between hunters and monsters. Fact 117 is that the weapon and armor descriptions in Monster Hunter Wilds constitute a secondary narrative layer that is as carefully constructed as the primary story, and players who read them consistently encounter lore details not available anywhere else in the game. The starting weapons available to players at the beginning of Wilds have a design philosophy embedded in their physical forms that reflects the history of the hunting tradition. These are not simply primitive versions of more advanced weapons. They are complete weapons in themselves, designed for functionality in their present form rather than as rough drafts of future refinements. The aesthetic language of the basic weapon tier in Wilds references a craftsmanship tradition that the flavor text describes as predating the current Research Commission expedition, suggesting the core weapon forms used in the game are inherited from a much older hunting lineage. Fact 118 is that the base weapon tier in Monster Hunter Wilds is designed to look like the product of a mature craft tradition rather than a starting point template, reflecting a design decision to present the hunter as an already trained professional entering a new environment rather than a novice acquiring their first tools. The Arkveld weapon tree is one of the most lore-dense trees in the game. As you progress through the tree, the item descriptions trace a progression from weapons made with the physical materials of standard Arkveld encounters to weapons that incorporate Guardian Arkveld components and the transformative properties of those components. The descriptions do not simply list the materials used, they describe what happens to the weapon when those materials are integrated, how the Curio-influenced components change the character of the weapon beyond the simple addition of new raw material properties. Fact 119 is that the Arkveld weapon tree narrates the transformation of craft from standard monster material utilization to something more complex, specifically describing in item text how the incorporation of Guardian Arkveld components changes the fundamental character of the weapon in ways that parallel what the Curio does to a host organism. The armor sets derived from Elder Dragon materials in Wilds have a specific design characteristic that distinguishes them from non-Elder Dragon armor. The surface patterns visible on Elder Dragon armor sets do not merely reference the visual characteristics of the source monster. They incorporate the specific elemental expression patterns of the Elder Dragon's biology in the surface treatment of the armor itself. The Duna armor, for example, shows what appear to be water flow patterns in its surface finish that correspond specifically to the bioluminescent flow patterns visible on Duna in its natural state. Fact 120 is that Elder Dragon armor in Monster Hunter Wilds incorporates the biological expression, patterns of the source organism into its aesthetic design in ways that are accurate to the source monster's living biology, suggesting the craftsmanship tradition in the game involves studying the source organism in detail rather than simply processing its materials. The Ruina Nergigante connection that some Wilds armor descriptions make, through references to materials acquired from historical expeditions, creates a continuity thread between Wilds and Monster Hunter World that is subtle but satisfying for franchise veterans. The descriptions do not make this connection explicit. They reference samples from the original survey area and describe properties consistent with the New World Elder Dragon encounters from World, but leave the specific connections to the player's knowledge of earlier game lore. Fact 121 is that certain armor descriptions in Monster Hunter Wilds contain implicit references to materials and monsters from Monster Hunter World that are only recognizable to players familiar with the earlier game, creating a continuity layer that rewards franchise knowledge without requiring it. The blacksmith character Gemma has a set of dialogue lines that reveal her crafting philosophy in ways that add to the lore of the game's material culture. She speaks about the weapons she makes not as products she manufactures, but as relationships between materials and function that she is trying to find rather than impose. This framing the craftsperson as discoverer rather than creator is consistent with the broader ecological philosophy of the game and reflects the way Monster Hunter craftsmanship is presented throughout the franchise as a form of ecological knowledge rather than simply technological skill. Fact 122 is that Gemma's dialogue articulates a crafting philosophy that frames weapon and armor making as ecological knowledge work rather than manufacturing, which connects the game's material culture to its broader ecological themes in a way that is philosophically coherent rather than decorative. The Psychrit-derived armor and weapons are unique in the Wilds roster for the way their item descriptions address the relationship between the hunter and the source organism. Most monster-derived gear descriptions focus on the properties of the material and how they translate into combat effectiveness. The Psychret gear descriptions instead focus on the bond between hunter and mount, framing the use of secret materials as a continuation of that relationship rather than a departure from it. Fact 123 is that the secret-derived gear descriptions frame the crafting of equipment from secret materials as a relational act rather than a purely material one, which is a unique framing in the Wilds gear roster and reflects the special status of the secret as both a companion and a material source. The upgrade paths for weapons in Wilds contain decision points where you choose between two or more directions of progression, and the descriptions of those alternate paths tell implicit stories about what different hunters in different contexts have chosen to prioritize. The alternate upgrade paths for mid-tier weapons, in particular, describe historical hunting contexts through their flavor text, referencing the environments and prey types that drove the development of each branch of the weapon tree. Fact 124 is that the alternate upgrade paths within weapon trees in Monster Hunter Wilds are framed through flavor text as historical divergences driven by specific hunting contexts, effectively documenting a history of weapon development through the choices made by hunters in the past. The armor skills system in Wilds is tied to lore in ways that are often overlooked. The named armor skills reference specific historical figures, places, and events in the Monster Hunter world through their descriptive text. A skill like Weakness Exploit, for example, has a description that references a specific hunting philosophy associated with a particular historical period of guild development. These references are brief and easy to miss, but they construct a history of craft and tactical knowledge development that runs through the entire game's gear roster. Fact 125 is that named armor skills in Monster Hunter Wilds contain historical references in their descriptions that document the development of tactical philosophy within the guild hunter tradition over time. The decorations and talisman system in Wilds has item descriptions that are among the most cosmologically interesting texts in the game.